The sun was just beginning to rise over the dusty back roads of Pine Hollow when a pair of flashing red and blue lights cut through the quiet morning. Eli Mercer didn't move, seated tall on his weathered 1972 Indian Chief, his posture steady, his gaze fixed on the empty road ahead. He looked more like a statue than a man. The engine rumbled beneath him, low and patient, like it knew better than to be afraid. Behind him, 2 patrol cars came to a stop. Officer Dana Rowe stepped out first, mirrored sunglasses on, voice sharp with assumption. "Is this some kind of joke?" she said, walking toward the bike. Eli didn't flinch. Her partner, fresh from academy training, followed with a smirk. "Sir, we're going to need you to shut that thing off and step aside." Still, Eli stayed right where he was, hands resting on the handlebars, silent and unmoved. He wasn't being defiant. He just didn't see any reason to rush, for them or anyone else. What neither officer realized was that in less than 20 minutes, the quiet country road would roar to life with the thunder of 12 military Humvees, and 50 soldiers would step out in formation. Eli Mercer wasn't what you'd call talkative. At 79, he had the kind of presence that didn't need words to command attention. He lived alone on a patch of land about 8 miles from town, in a white clapboard house with a tin roof and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. Folks in Pine Hollow didn't know much about him, just that he was polite, punctual, and always paid in cash. Every Friday, without fail, he rode his old Indian Chief into town, picked up a bag of groceries, filled up his tank, and sipped black coffee at the corner diner while reading the classifieds. His clothes were always clean, but worn. His boots scuffed, but solid. There was a quiet ritual to everything he did, like the man was moving on some inner clock the world had long forgotten. What they didn't see was the weight behind those steel blue eyes, or the way his hands moved with the precision of someone trained to fix machines or dismantle them. He didn't brag. He didn't correct people when they assumed he was just another old-timer clinging to his past. Eli had seen things he didn't speak of, done things he didn't wear on his sleeve. Decades of discipline shaped his every move, yet he never flaunted it. To most, he was just the quiet man on the old bike. But to those who truly watched, there was something about him that said, "This man has lived through storms you can't imagine." Officer Dana Rowe had been on the force for 9 years, long enough to feel confident in her instincts, but not quite long enough to question them. She was the type who kept her boots polished, her radio volume just loud enough to catch chatter, and her hand never far from her holster. In her mind, control wasn't just a part of the job, it was the job. She took one look at Eli Mercer's old motorcycle, the way it growled at idle like it had something to prove, and pegged the man as trouble before he even said a word. Her partner, Officer Greg Talley, was younger and greener, a former high school linebacker who still carries himself like the field was under his feet. He followed her lead, chin high, chest out, like he had something to prove. The two of them approached Eli with the confidence of people used to being obeyed. "Sir, step off the vehicle and show your papers," Rose said, her tone clipped, professional. Talley stood just behind her, smirking as he eyed the rusted chrome and faded paint. "Looks like this thing belongs in a scrapyard," he muttered. Eli handed over his license, calm and steady. Rose squinted at the date. 79? You sure you're safe riding something like this at your age? She didn't say it with malice, just assumption. That was the thing about people like her. They didn't need to be cruel to be dismissive. Sometimes doubt wore a badge and smiled. The situation started drawing eyes. A woman pushing a stroller slowed to watch. A man filling up his truck across the street paused, pump in hand. That man was Rick Moreno, owner of the gas station and a Gulf War veteran with a sharp memory for faces. He'd seen Eli Mercer roll in every week for the past 10 years, always early, always polite, never once caused trouble. Rick narrowed his eyes at the scene unfolding. 2 officers circling Eli like he'd done something wrong just by existing. He watched as Tally tapped the tailpipe of the motorcycle with his boot, like daring it to fall apart. Rowe asked again if Eli had anyone to call, someone who could come pick him up. The implication stung, even for Rick. Eli just stood there, not defensive, not angry, just steady, like the old tree in Rick's backyard that had weathered 3 tornado seasons without losing a limb. Rick knew that look. It wasn't confusing, it was patience, the kind that came from years of keeping calm when things got loud. Rick stepped back inside, grabbed the phone from under the counter, and pulled a worn business card from the drawer. Fort Redding Base. He hadn't used that number in years. As the line rang, he kept watching out the window. Eli hadn't moved. He didn't have to, because Rick knew what most folks didn't, that when someone like Eli stood still, it wasn't out of fear. It was because he was waiting for the right moment. Rowe had reached the limit of her patience. She couldn't read Eli Mercer, and that unsettled her. Most people fumbled when faced with authority, nervous hands, shaky voices, defensive explanations. But Eli just stood there, hands clasped behind his back, eyes steady on the horizon like he was waiting for the weather to change. That kind of silence made her feel small, and she didn't like it. "We're not going to stand here all day," she said sharply. "You're coming with us for a medical evaluation." She didn't raise her voice, but the shift in her tone drew the attention of the crowd. Greg Tally stepped in, hand hovering near his cuffs. "It's for your own good, sir. You could hurt someone riding like this." Eli blinked once, slowly. "In 59 years, I've never caused an accident." Rowe pressed forward. "Maybe that was true once, but you're not exactly in your prime anymore." A quiet murmur passed through the gathering bystanders. Some looked uncomfortable. Others pulled out their phones. Rick Moreno, still on the phone with the base, gave the officer on the line a detailed report, voice tight with urgency. "He's being cornered out here for nothing. They're trying to drag him in like he's some kind of liability." The voice on the other end paused, then changed completely. "Did you say Eli Mercer?" A beat. "Sir, stay where you are. Help is on the way." Back on the street, Rowe ordered Eli to turn around. "You're being detained for your safety and the public's." Eli didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. "On what grounds?" he asked, calm as ever. She hesitated. There was no statute, no crime, no regulation that backed her up. But now there were cameras, and stepping back would mean admitting she'd gone too far. Pride does strange things to people with power, and Eli Mercer had seen it ruin stronger ones than her. Something didn't sit right with Rowe, though she didn't say it out loud. She watched Eli from behind her sunglasses, trying to place what felt off, not wrong, just unfamiliar. This wasn't how most stops went. Most people fidgeted, explained, argued, folded. But Eli stood like a man who'd been through harder days than this one. There was a stillness in him that didn't feel passive. It felt earned. Rowe stole a glance at his ID again, lingering on the name. Mercer. She'd heard it before, couldn't say where, but it scratched at something in the back of her memory. Tally, meanwhile, kept up his routine, checking the bike, asking questions Eli didn't bother answering. "Does he even know where he is?" Tally muttered. "Feels like he's not all there." But Rowe wasn't so sure anymore. Eli wasn't confused. He was deliberate, and he hadn't missed a word they'd said. Then a voice rose from the crowd, an older man with a faded army cap. "Ain't that Eli Mercer?" he said to no one in particular. Another voice chimed in. "He used to train soldiers, I think. He taught combat tactics out west." Rowe turned, hearing the murmurs grow louder. Stories, rumors, names. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it, but doubt crept in. Tally didn't notice. He was too busy assuming control. But Rowe, she was starting to wonder if she'd made a mistake. If this wasn't just a routine stop, If this man wasn't just another senior on an outdated motorcycle. And the crowd, well, the crowd was beginning to sense the same thing. Tally made the move. He reached out and grabbed Eli's arm, not with aggression, but with enough pressure to show control. The crowd stirred. Phones were up. Ro took a step forward, signaling backup on her radio. "You're being escorted for a wellness evaluation," she said flatly. Eli didn't resist, didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at her with the calm of a man who'd already played this scene out in his mind a dozen times. "On what grounds?" he asked again. No anger, no panic, just clarity. That's when the sound hit. At first it was a low vibration, like a storm building beneath the ground. Then came the unmistakable thunder of military engines. Dust swirled in the air as 12 Humvees turned off the main road and barreled toward the scene, kicking up gravel and stopping in a perfect arc behind the crowd. Doors opened in unison, and 50 uniformed soldiers stepped out with precision and purpose. Their boots hit the pavement like a drumline. From the lead vehicle, a woman in full dress uniform approached. Captain Renee Calhoun, stern-eyed and unshakable. She stopped a few feet from Eli and raised her hand in a sharp salute. "Colonel Mercer," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Ro blinked, stunned. Tally froze. The crowd fell silent, a collective intake of breath passing through them like wind through dry leaves. Eli nodded once, acknowledging the salute with a slight tilt of his head. "Captain," he replied, as if they were meeting over morning coffee and not in the middle of a roadside confrontation. Calhoun turned to the officers, eyes cold. "Which one of you saw fit to detain a decorated war hero?" Her words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Ro opened her mouth, then closed it again. Tally backed up a step. Calhoun didn't wait for an answer. She looked back at her soldiers. "This man trained half of you. He taught battlefield logistics, led classified missions, and held honors most civilians wouldn't recognize. And today, he was treated like a criminal." Eli didn't gloat. He didn't even glance at the officers. He just stood quietly, like he'd known all along that the cavalry would come. Captain Calhoun stood between Eli Mercer and the officers, like a wall. The soldiers behind her hadn't moved an inch, their formation sharp, eyes focused. No one gave a command, but the message was crystal clear. Eli wasn't alone, and he wasn't someone to be handled lightly. Ro looked around, suddenly feeling the weight of every camera lens, every onlooker's stare. She had authority. But not like this, not the kind earned on foreign soil under fire. "Colonel Mercer," Calhoun said, voice steady, "do you need medical attention? Transportation? Escort back to your residence?" Eli shook his head once. "No, Captain, I'm fine, thank you." She nodded and didn't press further. Respect ran deep between them, and it didn't need words. Calhoun turned back to Ro, eyes sharp. "What exactly was the cause for this stop?" Ro opened her mouth, trying to retrieve protocol, but the words felt empty now. "Routine safety check," she muttered. "Concern for public safety." Calhoun took a slow step closer. "Let me be clear. This man trained me. He trained dozens of us standing here. If you had done your job with half the attention to detail he taught us, we wouldn't be here." The crowd was silent, but the tension had shifted. Before, they were watching with uncertainty. Now, it was judgment, and it wasn't aimed at Eli. Tally looked like he wanted to disappear. Ro straightened her shoulders, trying to salvage control. "We didn't know who he was." Calhoun's expression didn't change. "That's not an excuse. You didn't ask, you assumed. You saw age, not history. You saw rust, not experience." Eli stood quietly, hands still behind his back, the picture of dignity. He didn't need to say a word. The people speaking for him had already arrived, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the power in the moment no longer belonged to the badge. It belonged to the truth, standing calm in front of a line of soldiers ready to defend it. Ro took a breath and stepped toward Eli, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier edge. "Colonel Mercer, I'm sorry. We didn't mean any harm." Eli looked at her, eyes clear but unreadable, and nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I understand," he said, "but intent and impact aren't the same thing." Around them the crowd stood still, phones lowered but eyes wide, absorbing the shift. The story had changed. What began as a routine stop had become something else entirely, a moment that peeled back assumptions and laid bare the truth. Calhoun turned to the soldiers and gave a subtle signal. In perfect silence, they stepped into formation, creating a path between the crowd and Eli's motorcycle. He walked toward it without a word, climbed on with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and kicked the engine to life. The rumble filled the street again, deep and steady, like thunder rolling in the distance. Eli didn't revise it. He didn't show off. He simply rode forward, through the corridor of uniforms, heads held high on both sides. The crowd watched in reverent silence, the same way one watches a flag being raised. No cheers, no applause, just respect. As Eli disappeared down the road, the tension dissolved, replaced by a quiet reckoning. Ro stood where he'd left her, feeling the weight of her badge in a different way than she had that morning. Some lessons came with handbooks. Others arrived on 2 wheels, wearing quiet pride. By the following morning, the story had traveled far beyond Pine Hollow. Cell phone footage of the Humvees, the salute, and Eli Mercer's quiet ride through the formation had gone viral. At the local precinct, Sheriff Warren Mathers sat behind his desk, jaw tight as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. Captain Calhoun didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her words were sharp, measured, and carried the full weight of the institution she represented. "We're not pursuing legal action," she said. "That's not what Colonel Mercer wants, but we expect change." The sheriff agreed before she even finished the sentence. Later that week, a mandatory department-wide meeting was called. Officers from every shift packed into the briefing room, eyes forward as the projector clicked on. New policies were introduced, protocols for elder interactions, training sessions on implicit bias, and a formal partnership with Fort Reading to establish regular workshops on community engagement. At the front of the room, Officer Dana Rowe stood to speak. Her voice didn't shake, but it didn't carry the same swagger it once had. "Last week, I made a mistake," she said plainly. "Not because I didn't follow rules, but because I didn't see the man in front of me. I saw a situation. I saw risk. I didn't see a person." Around her, officers listened without fidgeting. This wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability. Somewhere down the road, that would matter more. Mistakes could be corrected, but only if they were faced head-on in full daylight. A few days later, Officer Rowe turned off the highway and eased her patrol car down a gravel road framed by tall oaks and rusted fence posts. The property was quiet, peaceful. Just a white farmhouse, a tin-roofed barn, and a garden that looked tended by hand, not by habit. She parked beside an old tractor, stepped out, and spotted Eli under the hood of his motorcycle, grease on his sleeves and a socket wrench in his hand. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Coffee's fresh," he said without turning. She followed him inside, sat at a wooden table worn smooth with time. 2 mismatched mugs clinked against the surface. "I've been thinking about that day," Rowe said after a long silence. "About what I assumed, about how I handled it." Eli didn't interrupt. He let her speak. "I became a cop because I wanted to serve people," she continued. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people. I started seeing categories." Eli took a sip and looked out the window toward the fields. "Respect doesn't come from the badge," he said. "It comes from how you carry yourself, how you treat the ones no one's watching." She nodded, a little tighter in the chest than she expected. Outside, the sun was setting over the pasture, gold stretching across the land. That old motorcycle sat quiet under the tree, still standing, still capable, still ready to ride. So was Eli. And in a way, so was she. Sometimes, the strongest people wear the quietest expressions. They don't announce their history or ask for recognition. They show up, they endure, and they carry more than anyone realizes. Eli Mercer didn't need to prove anything that day. His record, his discipline, and the way others responded spoke louder than medals ever could. What happened on that roadside wasn't just about a motorcycle or an officer's mistake. It was about the danger of assumptions and the power of presence. It reminded everyone watching, whether in uniform, behind a camera, or scrolling through a feed, that respect isn't something you give based on appearance. It's something you give because every person carries a story you haven't heard. And if we're lucky, we get a chance to listen before it's too late. So before you judge the next person who moves slower, speaks less, or stands a little too still, ask yourself, do you really know who they are? Or have you only seen what you wanted to see? If this story meant something to you, take a moment to share it. Someone out there may need the reminder that silence isn't weakness, and honor often rides on two wheels.